Margaret's hands trembled as she held the yellowed passenger manifest closer to the flickering candle flame. The name stared back at her in elegant copperplate script: Eleanor Whitmore, age 34. Cabin assignment, private. Her grandmother's maiden name, written in ink that had survived over a century in this hidden chamber. "Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm rattling the manor's ancient bones. "Come look at this." Her husband shuffled across the dusty floorboards, his breathing labored from the exertion of moving the heavy bookshelf that had concealed the room's entrance. At 72, Henry's body bore the weight of a lifetime spent teaching mathematics at the local grammar school, his shoulders now permanently curved from decades of leaning over students' desks. The cancer diagnosis 6 months ago had only accelerated his decline. "What is it, love?" He peered over her shoulder, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Margaret pointed to the name with a shaking finger. "This can't be right. Grandmother Eleanor died in the influenza outbreak of 1919. She never traveled anywhere, certainly not on—" Her voice trailed off as the implications settled in her mind like sediment in still water. The sealed room was a testament to wealth beyond their wildest imagination. Stacks of bearer bonds lay arranged in precise rows along one wall, each bundle wrapped in oiled cloth and marked with denominations that made Margaret's pension seem like pocket change. A massive safe stood open in the corner, its contents spilled across an ornate Persian rug, more bonds, jewelry that caught the candlelight like trapped stars, and leather portfolios thick with documents. But it was the correspondence that truly chilled her. Letters bearing the letterhead of White Star Line executives, maritime insurance companies, and names she recognized from history books. J.P. Morgan's signature appeared on several documents, alongside figures and calculations that seemed to reduce human lives to mere accounting entries. "Margaret, look at the date on this." Henry held up a telegram, his teacher's instincts still sharp despite his illness. "April 10th, 1912. 4 days before the Titanic hit the iceberg." She took the telegram with trembling hands. The message was brief but devastating. Arrangements confirmed. Selected passengers secured in designated sections. Proceed as planned. Payment transferred upon completion. A gust of wind sent the candle flame dancing, casting grotesque shadows across the walls lined with maritime charts and passenger lists. Margaret had spent 40 years as Southampton's head librarian, organizing and cataloging the stories of others. She understood the weight of documents, the power of the written word to preserve truth or bury it. These papers felt different, dangerous, like handling lit dynamite. "We should call someone," Henry said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The authorities, perhaps, or a historian." Margaret shook her head slowly. Her grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of a young woman who had worked as a seamstress in Southampton's docks, stitching clothes for wealthy passengers bound for America. Eleanor had always spoken of the crossing that never was, a phrase Margaret had dismissed as the romantic musings of an old woman. Now she wondered if her grandmother had been trying to tell her something far more sinister. She picked up another document, this one bearing an official seal. It was a contract, written in dense legal language, but certain phrases leaped out at her: elimination of specified individuals, insurance claims to be processed without investigation, survivors to be selected according to attached manifest. The storm outside seemed to mock their discovery, as if the manor itself was laughing at their naivety. They had come here hoping to sell off furniture and artwork to pay for Henry's treatments, never imagining they would stumble upon evidence of mass murder disguised as maritime tragedy. "Look at this," Margaret whispered, holding up a photograph. It showed a group of men in expensive suits standing on a dock, the Titanic visible in the background. On the back, someone had written names and dates. Several names were crossed out in red ink, with notations like eliminated and objective achieved. Henry sank into a leather chair that released a cloud of dust. "Oh my God, Margaret, what have we found?" She continued examining the documents, her librarian's training taking over despite her shock. There were passenger lists that didn't match the official records, insurance policies taken out on specific individuals just days before departure, and most disturbing of all, a detailed plan showing which sections of the ship had been deliberately weakened. The candle guttered in the draft, and Margaret realized they had been in the hidden room for over an hour. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the manor's electricity had been disconnected years ago. They were alone with their discovery in a house that suddenly felt far less like inheritance and far more like a trap. As she carefully stacked the documents, Margaret caught sight of one final paper at the bottom of the pile. It was a recent letter, dated just 3 weeks ago, addressed to the current residents of Ashford Manor. The message was simple: "We know you found it. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." The recent letter slipped from Margaret's fingers like a living thing, fluttering to the floor between them. The candlelight made the words seem to writhe on the paper, and she found herself stepping backward instinctively, bumping into Henry's chair. "That's impossible," Henry breathed, his voice hoarse. "How could anyone know we need to leave. Now." Margaret's librarian instincts, honed by decades of protecting valuable collections, screamed danger. She began hastily gathering the most important documents, her hands moving with practiced efficiency even as her mind reeled. "Help me with these bonds." They worked in tense silence, stuffing priceless bearer bonds and damning correspondence into Henry's worn canvas messenger bag, the same one he'd carried to school every day for 30 years. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that her husband's retirement gift now held evidence of a conspiracy that could rewrite history. The storm had intensified, and the manor's windows rattled like chattering teeth. Every creak of the old timbers made Margaret's pulse spike. She found herself listening for footsteps, for voices, for any sign they weren't alone in this cursed place. "The photograph," she whispered, snatching up the image of the suited men, "and this passenger manifest with grandmother's name." Henry struggled to his feet, the bag weighing heavily on his thin shoulders. The cancer treatments had stolen so much of his strength, and Margaret felt a familiar pang of guilt for dragging him into this. 6 months ago, their biggest worry had been whether their combined pensions would cover his chemotherapy. Now they were fleeing through a storm with evidence of mass murder. "Can you make it back through the passage?" she asked, studying his pale face in the candlelight. He nodded, though she could see the effort it cost him. "I've spent 40 years chasing after runaway students, Margaret. I can manage one more adventure." She squeezed his free hand, feeling the wedding ring that had grown loose on his finger. 43 years of marriage, and she'd never loved him more than in this moment, standing in a hidden room full of horrors, his body failing him, yet still trying to protect her with gentle humor. They made their way back through the narrow passage behind the bookshelf, Margaret leading with the candle. The confined space felt oppressive now, loaded with menace rather than mystery. Each step took them further from the revelation that had shattered their quiet retirement, but she knew there was no returning to ignorance. Back in the main library, Margaret helped Henry settle the bookshelf back into position. To any casual observer, the wall would appear solid, unmarked, but she could feel the weight of what lay hidden behind those leather-bound volumes that had probably been selected specifically to conceal the entrance. Even the titles seemed ominous now: Tragedy at Sea, The Unsinkable Dream, Maritime Disasters of the Modern Era. "We can't go back to the cottage," she said, voicing what they both knew. "Not tonight. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." Henry lowered himself onto a dusty sofa, his breathing labored. "The Premier Inn on the motorway?" Margaret nodded, already calculating. They had perhaps £200 between them, money they'd scraped together for this weekend trip to assess their unexpected inheritance. The distant relative who'd left them Ashford Manor had been a complete stranger, a great-nephew of Henry's father who'd died intestate. The solicitor's letter had seemed like providence when Henry's medical bills were mounting. Now she wondered if their inheritance had been as random as it appeared. "Margaret," Henry said quietly, "that recent letter, someone's been watching this place. Watching for us." She pulled her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders. At 68, she'd thought her days of adventure were behind her. Her life had been pleasantly predictable: morning tea, evening news, Sunday roasts with their daughter Sarah and the grandchildren. She'd spent her career preserving other people's stories, never imagining she'd become part of one herself. "Do you remember what I told you about grandmother Eleanor?" she asked, sinking beside him on the sofa. how she used to have nightmares about ships sinking. Henry nodded. You said she'd wake up screaming about people trapped below deck. I always thought it was just an old woman's fears. But what if she survived something? What if she knew what really happened and carried that secret her whole life? Outside, lightning illuminated the library's tall windows, revealing the storm's fury. Margaret thought of their small cottage back in Southampton, of the garden Henry tended so carefully despite his weakness, of their quiet routines that had sustained them through his diagnosis. Everything they'd built together felt fragile now, threatened by forces they couldn't yet comprehend. The bag containing the documents sat between them like an unexploded bomb. Inside were bearer bonds worth a fortune, enough to pay for Henry's treatment to secure their future, but also evidence that someone had orchestrated one of history's greatest tragedies for profit. Margaret reached for her husband's hand, feeling the familiar comfort of his touch even as her world tilted on its axis. The sound of a car engine cut through the storm's fury, its headlights sweeping across the library windows like searchlights. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs as she grabbed Henry's arm, pulling him down below the windowsill. "Did you see how many?" she whispered, her mouth suddenly dry as parchment. Henry's face had gone ashen, his breathing shallow. 2 cars at least. They're not using the main drive. Coming up from the side road. They crouched behind the sofa, the canvas bag pressed between them. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The recent letter had made it clear someone was watching, waiting, but she'd foolishly assumed they'd have time to process their discovery, to decide what to do with the explosive evidence they'd found. Car doors slammed shut in the distance, the sound muffled by wind and rain but unmistakably deliberate. These weren't casual visitors seeking shelter from the storm. The back entrance, Margaret breathed, through the kitchen. They moved carefully in the darkness, Margaret leading the way through rooms she'd barely explored that morning. Her grandmother's stories echoed in her mind now with new urgency. Eleanor's fevered whispers about the ones who profit from drowning, words Margaret had attributed to delirium during her final illness. How naive she'd been to dismiss them as rambling. The kitchen door was swollen with moisture, requiring both their weights to force it open. The storm hit them like a physical blow, rain stinging their faces and soaking through their clothes within seconds. Margaret's careful silver hair, pinned back in her usual neat bun, came loose in the wind. "The car," Henry gasped, pointing toward their aging Ford Fiesta parked behind the manor. They stumbled across the muddy courtyard, Margaret's sensible shoes sliding on the wet stones. Behind them, she heard the crash of the front door being forced open, followed by voices, low, urgent, professional, not police, something far more dangerous. Henry fumbled with the car keys, his hands shaking from cold and fear. The engine turned over once, twice, then died. Margaret found herself praying to a God she'd only addressed in church services, bargaining with whatever force might be listening to protect the gentle man beside her who'd never hurt anyone in his 72 years. The third try caught, and the engine roared to life just as flashlight beams appeared in the kitchen doorway. Margaret saw dark shapes moving purposefully through the house, searching. "Go, go," she urged, and Henry pressed the accelerator harder than he'd probably driven in decades. They careened down the muddy lane, branches scraping the car's sides. In the rearview mirror, Margaret watched the manor's windows fill with moving lights, like a ship being boarded by pirates. The metaphor made her stomach clench. Everything came back to ships now, to her grandmother's terrified stories and the damning evidence in the bag between her feet. "Where are we going?" Henry asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Margaret's mind was working frantically, sorting through options with the same systematic approach she'd used to reorganize Southampton Library's entire catalog system. Home was compromised. The letter proved that much. Their daughter Sarah lived too close, and Margaret wouldn't risk exposing her grandchildren to whatever forces were hunting them. Hotels would require identification, leaving a paper trail. The M27, she decided. Portsmouth direction. There's a service station. We need to think. As they joined the motorway, anonymous among late-night travelers, Margaret finally allowed herself to examine what they'd truly stumbled into. The bearer bonds alone represented a fortune that most people couldn't comprehend, but their value paled beside the historical implications of the documents. If the evidence was authentic, and her decades of handling historical materials told her it was, then the Titanic disaster had been partially orchestrated, specific passengers targeted for elimination, and her grandmother's name was on the secret manifest. "Henry," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something about Grandmother Eleanor that I've never shared with anyone." He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the rain-slicked road. "When I was 12, I found her one night in the garden, fully dressed at 3 in the morning. She was staring at the sky and crying. When I asked what was wrong, she said she could still hear them calling from the water. She made me promise never to tell anyone about the crossing, about the names she remembered." "What names?" Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She said there were passengers who paid to disappear, and others who were paid to ensure they never reached America. She said the real passenger list was hidden somewhere safe, waiting for someone to find the truth." The service station appeared ahead, its bright lights a beacon in the storm. As Henry pulled into the car park, Margaret clutched the bag tighter, feeling the weight of history and conspiracy pressing down on her shoulders. "We have a choice," she said, meeting her husband's eyes. "We can destroy these documents, return to our quiet life, and pretend this never happened. Or we finish what my grandmother started and expose the truth about what really happened to the Titanic." The fluorescent lights of the service station cast harsh shadows across Henry's face as he turned off the engine. Margaret sat motionless, the bag of documents heavy in her lap, watching late-night travelers hurry between the petrol pumps and the shop. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, blissfully unaware that history itself might be sitting in a battered Ford Fiesta 20 feet away. "I keep thinking about our Tuesday routine," Henry said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the rain drumming on the roof. "Tea at 4, the crossword puzzle, watching the news together on the sofa. When did we last have a Tuesday that simple?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "6 weeks ago, before your last treatment. You complained about the cryptic clues being too easy." They sat in silence, watching a young mother wrestle a screaming toddler into a car seat while her partner filled their tank. Normal problems, normal lives. Margaret found herself desperately envious of that woman's biggest worry being a tired child rather than century-old murder conspiracies. "My grandmother carried this burden for 70 years, she whispered, opening the bag slightly to glimpse the bearer bonds inside. "She was 23 when the Titanic sank, working in Southampton's garment district. I always wondered why she never married until she was 35, why she jumped every time someone mentioned ships or crossing the Atlantic." Henry's breathing had steadied, but she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. The chase from the manor had drained reserves he couldn't afford to lose. His next chemotherapy session was in 3 days, if they were still alive to make it. "What if we're wrong?" he asked. "What if those documents are elaborate forgeries, planted to drive someone mad with conspiracy theories? What if we've destroyed our peaceful retirement chasing shadows?" Margaret had wondered the same thing. Her professional instincts told her the papers were authentic. The watermarks, the aged ink, the period-appropriate letterhead all spoke to genuine artifacts. But 40 years of cataloging historical documents had also taught her how sophisticated forgeries could be, especially when created by people with unlimited resources and patience. "Then we'll have wasted our final months together playing detective instead of tending your garden," she admitted. "But Henry, what if we're right? What if 1,500 people died not because of arrogance or bad luck, but because someone decided their deaths would be profitable?" She thought of the passenger manifest hidden in the bag, her grandmother's name listed among dozens of others under a column headed expendable assets. Eleanor Whitmore, age 23, seamstress. The notation beside her name read, "Survived, to be monitored." Monitored for 70 years. Perhaps that's why Eleanor had never spoken directly about what she'd witnessed, why she'd buried her trauma in cryptic warnings and midnight tears. Someone had been watching, ensuring her silence, generation after generation. "Those men at the manor weren't historians or government officials," Margaret continued, her voice growing steadier as her librarian's analytical mind took control. They moved like military, like people accustomed to making problems disappear. The letter waiting for us wasn't a bluff. They've been prepared for this moment since 1912. Henry turned to study her face in the harsh station lighting. You want to go public, don't you? Contact the press, upload everything to the internet before they can stop us. I want to honor my grandmother's memory, Margaret said firmly. I want those 1,500 souls to finally have justice. And yes, I want to ensure Sarah and the grandchildren inherit a world where the truth matters more than the convenience of the powerful. But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her resolve. They were pensioners with no allies, no resources beyond their combined savings and the devastating evidence in an old teacher's bag. Against them stood forces wealthy and ruthless enough to orchestrate maritime disasters and maintain silence for over a century. What about your treatments? She asked quietly. If we run, if we fight this, there won't be time for hospitals and doctor's appointments. We'd be sacrificing whatever time we have left together. Henry reached across the center console to take her hand, his fingers cold but steady. Margaret, I've been thinking about time differently since the diagnosis. Not how much we have left, but what we do with whatever remains. Would you rather spend 6 more months in quiet denial or 3 months fighting for something that matters? A police car pulled into the station, its occupants ordering coffee and seemingly unaware of the elderly couple, debating whether to upend world history. Margaret watched the officers laugh together at some shared joke, their biggest concern probably paperwork and overtime schedules. She opened the bag again, pulling out the photograph of suited men standing before the Titanic. Their faces bore the satisfied expressions of businessmen closing a profitable deal, untroubled by moral considerations. One face had been circled in red ink, a young man whose notation read current air, monitor indefinitely. The resemblance to Henry was unmistakable. The photograph trembled in Margaret's hands as the full implications crashed over her like the frigid Atlantic waters that had claimed so many lives. Henry's great-great-uncle stared back at them from across the centuries, his face bearing the same gentle eyes and stubborn jawline that had made her fall in love with a young teacher 45 years ago. "They've been watching your family," she whispered, the words barely audible above the rain. "For over a century they've been watching the Ashford line." Henry leaned closer to examine the photograph, his face growing paler as he recognized the family resemblance. The notation was written in different handwriting than the original documents, added decades later, updated by someone maintaining meticulous records across generations. "That's why we inherited the manor," he said, his voice hollow with understanding. "Not because some distant relative died intestate, because they needed us to find that room, needed to see if we'd stay silent like Eleanor did, or if we'd become a problem requiring elimination." Margaret felt the world shift beneath them, their entire inheritance revealed as an elaborate test. The storm, their desperate flight, even this moment of discovery. Had it all been orchestrated? Were those men at the manor eliminating evidence, or had they simply been waiting to see what choice the latest Ashford descendant would make? She thought of her grandmother's midnight garden vigils, the way Eleanor had flinched whenever ships appeared on television broadcasts, how she'd made Margaret promise never to cross the water on holiday trips. Not the superstitions of a frightened old woman, but the careful warnings of someone who understood exactly how far the conspiracy reached. "We can't go home," Margaret said, the finality of it settling into her bones. At 68, she was about to become a fugitive from forces that had toppled governments and sunk ships. "We can't call Sarah, can't return to our life." The moment we discovered that room, everything changed. Henry started the engine, his movements decisive despite his physical frailty. Then we moved forward. No more looking back at Tuesday crosswords and garden roses. If they've been monitoring my family for a century, they already know everything about us, our routines, our friends, our weaknesses. Where can we go that they won't follow? "London," he said, pulling back onto the motorway with newfound determination. "The British Museum has a specialist in maritime disasters, Dr. Patricia Holbrook. I attended her lecture on historical maritime investigations 3 years ago. If anyone can authenticate these documents independently, it's her. Margaret felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. Dr. Holbrook's name was familiar from academic journals she'd read during her librarian years. A meticulous researcher known for exposing historical cover-ups, someone who'd built her career on refusing to accept convenient official narratives. But if we contact her, we'll be exposing her to the same danger, Margaret pointed out, her conscience wrestling with necessity. These people killed 1,500 passengers to protect their interests. They won't hesitate to eliminate a historian. Patricia Holbrook has been investigating maritime conspiracies for 20 years, Henry replied, his teacher's voice taking on the tone he'd once used to convince reluctant students to tackle difficult subjects. She's probably been waiting her entire career for evidence like this. We'd be giving her the greatest discovery in maritime history. The motorway stretched ahead of them, anonymous among the night traffic. Margaret looked back once at the service station's fading lights, knowing she was leaving behind everything familiar and safe. Their cottage with Henry's carefully tended roses, their quiet routines, their peaceful retirement, all of it was gone now, swept away by the revelation that their entire inheritance had been a trap designed to test their compliance. But alongside the fear, she felt something else stirring, a fierce determination that reminded her of her grandmother's strength. Eleanor had survived whatever happened on that crossing, had protected her family for 70 years through silence and vigilance. Now it was Margaret's turn to protect the truth, to ensure that the 1,500 souls lost in the Atlantic finally received the justice they'd been denied. "We stop being victims tonight," she said firmly, clutching the bag of evidence against her chest. "We stop running scared and start fighting back." Henry reached over to squeeze her hand, and she felt the wedding ring that had grown loose during his treatments. Whatever time they had left, weeks, months, or years, they would spend it pursuing something larger than their own comfort. The Titanic's victims had been silenced by dark water and darker conspiracies, but their story would finally be told, no matter the cost. Margaret and Henry Thornfield had crossed their threshold, leaving safety behind to enter a world where truth mattered more than survival. There would be no turning back now. The first rule of their new world, Margaret realized as dawn broke over London's outskirts, was that nowhere was truly safe. Even approaching Dr. Patricia Holbrook required careful strategy. Academic colleagues could be compromised, university emails monitored, phone calls traced. They'd stopped at a grimy motorway services near Reading, where Henry had used a payphone to contact the British Museum, speaking in the careful code of academics. He was a retired teacher researching family genealogy, with interesting maritime connections, and would Dr. Holbrook have time for an informal consultation? Dr. Holbrook's assistant had been politely dismissive until Henry mentioned bearer bonds and passenger manifests. The pause that followed told them everything. This wasn't the first time someone had approached the maritime historian with Titanic conspiracies, but something in Henry's quiet desperation had caught her attention. "Russell Square Gardens," the assistant had finally said. 11:30. "Dr. Holbrook will be feeding the pigeons near the fountain. She'll have a red scarf." Now, watching the elegant woman scatter breadcrumbs while scanning the park with professional wariness, Margaret understood they weren't the only ones operating under new rules. Dr. Patricia Holbrook moved like someone accustomed to clandestine meetings, her academic credentials a cover for investigative work that clearly extended far beyond university lectures. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, I presume." Dr. Holbrook was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't offer to shake hands, keeping her movements casual as dog walkers and joggers passed around them. "I confess your call intrigued me. In 20 years of maritime research, I've heard every Titanic theory imaginable. What makes your family genealogy different?" Henry glanced at Margaret, who opened her bag carefully, withdrawing a single bearer bond, the least incriminating document they carried. Dr. Holbrook's eyes widened as she examined the aged paper, her academic excitement warring with obvious alarm. "Where did you acquire this?" "We inherited a Southampton estate," Margaret said quietly, "from a relative we'd never heard of. Behind the library, We found a sealed room that hadn't been opened since April 15, 1912. Dr. Holbrook went very still. Show me the rest. But not here, too exposed. She led them through Russell Square's winding paths, past the Georgian terraces, and into the museum's staff entrance, where her credentials allowed them access without signing visitor logs. Margaret felt the weight of surveillance technology everywhere. Cameras, card readers, digital traces that could reveal their location to anyone with sufficient resources and connections. In here, Dr. Holbrook ushered them into a cluttered office lined with maritime artifacts and historical documents. The walls displayed photographs of sunken vessels, newspaper clippings about maritime disasters, and a large map of the North Atlantic marked with ship positions from April 1912. I've been investigating Titanic irregularities since 2003 when I discovered discrepancies in the official passenger lists, small inconsistencies, names that appeared in some records but not others. Margaret spread the hidden documents across Dr. Holbrook's desk, watching the historian's face cycle through disbelief, excitement, and growing horror as she absorbed the implications. The confession letter drew particular attention, Dr. Holbrook photographing each page with practiced efficiency. These watermarks match other 1912 White Star Line correspondence I've examined, she murmured, using a magnifying glass to study the paper fibers. The ink composition appears period-appropriate, the letterhead authentic. If these are forgeries, they're the most sophisticated I've ever encountered. What would it mean if they're genuine? Henry asked. Dr. Holbrook sat back heavily in her chair. It would mean the greatest maritime disaster in history was partially orchestrated murder, that certain passengers were targeted for elimination, their deaths disguised by a tragedy that killed hundreds of innocents as collateral damage. She pulled out a thick file labeled Titanic Anomalies and began cross-referencing the secret manifest with her own research. Margaret watched names align, patterns emerge, pieces of a century-old puzzle finally clicking into place. Your grandmother's survival, Dr. Holbrook said suddenly, pointing to Eleanor's name on the list. According to these documents, she witnessed something during the crossing that made her valuable as a living asset rather than a casualty. They kept her alive to monitor what she knew, ensure her silence. And my family line? Henry's voice was barely steady. Thomas Ashford, Dr. Holbrook read from the confession letter, financial coordinator for the operation. It appears his descendants were watched indefinitely in case knowledge of the conspiracy passed down through family records or oral tradition. She looked up grimly. You were never meant to inherit that manor accidentally. This was a test. Would you stay silent like Eleanor, or would you become a liability requiring permanent solution? Margaret felt the full weight of their enemy's patience and resources settling over them like a shroud. A conspiracy sophisticated enough to orchestrate the Titanic's sinking wouldn't it hesitate to eliminate two pensioners who'd stumbled onto dangerous truths. But looking at Dr. Holbrook's determined expression, she realized they'd found something precious in this new world, an ally willing to risk everything for justice. The silence in Dr. Holbrook's office stretched taut as they absorbed the full magnitude of their situation. Margaret watched the historian's fingers trace the passenger manifest, her academic excitement tempered by professional caution. Outside, London bustled on in blissful ignorance while they sat surrounded by evidence that could rewrite history or get them killed. We need to move carefully, Dr. Holbrook said finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what they were facing. If these documents are authentic, we're not dealing with amateur conspirators. This level of organization, the century-long monitoring of family lines, we're confronting institutional power that spans generations. Margaret felt Henry's hand find hers, his palm clammy despite the office's warmth. His next chemotherapy session was tomorrow, but that appointment now seemed like a luxury from their former life, a normal problem in a world that no longer existed for them. What's our first move? Margaret asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. 40 years of organizing information had taught her that even the most complex problems could be broken down into manageable steps. Dr. Holbrook moved to her computer, then stopped, her hand hovering over the keyboard. Nothing digital, If they've been monitoring your family for a century, they'll have access to university networks, government databases, everything connected to the internet. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook instead, the old-fashioned kind Margaret remembered from her early librarian days. We need independent verification from multiple sources before we go public, Dr. Holbrook continued, writing in careful longhand. The National Archives has sealed maritime records from 1912. The families of known Titanic passengers would have private documents, letters, diaries, photographs that might corroborate these passenger manifests. Henry shifted in his chair, and Margaret caught the slight wince he tried to hide. The stress was wearing on him, compounding the physical toll of his treatments. She wanted to suggest they find somewhere safe to rest, but the luxury of rest might no longer exist for any of them. "How long do we have?" Margaret asked. "Before they realize we're not going to stay quietly at home, pretending we never found that room?" "They already know," Dr. Holbrook said grimly. "The moment you contacted me, surveillance protocols would have activated. We're probably being watched right now." She gestured toward the window overlooking the museum courtyard. Academic institutions are riddled with intelligence connections, especially when it comes to historical research that could embarrass powerful interests. Margaret felt the walls of the office pressing closer. Every choice they made seemed to narrow their options further, drawing them deeper into a world where retirement-aged academics became targets for elimination. "Then why help us?" Henry asked. "Why risk your career, your life, for two strangers with an impossible story?" Dr. Holbrook's expression softened slightly, revealing the passionate historian beneath the cautious professional facade. "Because 20 years ago, my grandfather died under suspicious circumstances while investigating maritime insurance fraud. The official report called it suicide, but he'd been receiving threats, warned to stop digging into certain shipping records." She touched a framed photograph on her desk, an elderly man standing beside a ship. "I became a maritime historian to finish his work. This evidence might finally give me the tools to expose what he died trying to uncover." Margaret realized they weren't just gaining an ally, they were stepping into a larger pattern of resistance, joining others who'd spent decades pursuing fragments of the same truth. The conspiracy that killed Titanic passengers and monitored families for generations had also created its own opposition. Historians and researchers who'd noticed the inconsistencies, the covered tracks, the convenient deaths of those who asked too many questions. "We'll need to separate," Dr. Holbrook continued, her planning taking on military precision. 3 different research tracks, multiple backup plans. Margaret, your librarian background makes you ideal for archival work. I have contacts at private historical societies, places that aren't digitally cataloged. Henry, your teaching connections could help us reach families of Titanic passengers, people who might have inherited documents their relatives never shared publicly. "And if we're caught?" Margaret asked. "We won't be caught together," Dr. Holbrook replied firmly. "Distributed risk, multiple contingencies. They can't monitor every archive, every private collection, every descendant family simultaneously. Our advantage is that the truth wants to be discovered. After a century of silence, the evidence is scattered across dozens of locations, waiting for someone brave enough to connect the pieces." Margaret looked at Henry, seeing her own resolution reflected in his tired eyes. They'd moved beyond the point where safety mattered more than justice, where personal survival trumped moral obligation. The documents in her bag weren't just evidence, they were a sacred trust, connecting them to 1,500 souls who'd died unavenged and a grandmother who'd carried terrible secrets to her grave. "When do we start?" Henry asked. Dr. Holbrook checked her watch, then began gathering specific files from her cabinets. "Now. Every hour we delay gives them more time to eliminate witnesses, destroy evidence, or simply make us disappear." She handed Margaret a list of locations. "By this evening, we'll either have enough corroborating evidence to go public safely, or we'll be running for our lives." The weight of the approaching challenge settled over them like a gathering storm. They were no longer just retirees who'd stumbled onto dangerous secrets. They were active participants in a conspiracy that had been unfolding since 1912, finally positioned to expose the truth that powerful forces had spent over a century concealing. The ordeal begins. Margaret's hands trembled as she studied the list of locations Dr. Holbrook had given her. The addresses stretched across London and beyond, private collections, family estates, forgotten archives that existed in the gaps between official records. Each destination represented a fragment of truth that might corroborate their impossible discovery, but also a potential trap where century-old conspiracies could finally silence them permanently. The Pemberton collection in Belgravia, Dr. Holbrook explained, pointing to the first address. Lady Pemberton's great-uncle was a White Star Line clerk who kept private copies of correspondence. She's 93, lives alone, refuses to digitize anything. If those passenger manifests are authentic, she might have supporting documentation. Henry examined his own list with the methodical attention he'd once given to lesson plans, but Margaret could see the fear beneath his academic composure. This wasn't research anymore. It was survival disguised as scholarship. Every contact they made, every archive they visited, increased the chances that they'd be discovered by forces that had spent 111 years perfecting the art of eliminating inconvenient witnesses. "What if we're walking into surveillance?" Margaret asked, voicing the question that haunted all of them. "These families, these collections, what if they're being monitored?" "Then we'll know quickly," Dr. Holbrook replied with grim pragmatism. "But we can't let fear paralyze us. Your grandmother Eleanor survived by staying silent, but silence won't save you now. They already know you found the sealed room. Your only protection is making the truth too public to suppress." Margaret thought of Eleanor's careful life, the way she'd cultivated invisibility after her mysterious return from that 1912 crossing. 70 years of vigilance, of never speaking about what she'd witnessed, of raising a family under the constant weight of dangerous knowledge. Now that protective silence was shattered, and Margaret felt the full exposure of stepping into the light, where her enemies could see her clearly. Dr. Holbrook handed them each a mobile phone. Burner phones, purchased with cash. "We check in every 2 hours. If someone misses a check-in, the others assume the worst and implement emergency protocols." She paused, meeting their eyes seriously. Emergency protocols mean abandoning the evidence collection and going directly to multiple news organizations simultaneously. Better to publish incomplete information than let all of us disappear quietly. The weight of their isolation struck Margaret fully for the first time. Henry's cancer support group, their neighbors, their routine medical appointments, all the normal human connections that made life predictable and safe were now potential vulnerabilities. They couldn't contact anyone from their former lives without risking exposure, couldn't retreat to familiar places without leading their enemies straight to them. "I'm scared," Margaret admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. Not just scared of physical danger, though that fear was real enough. She was terrified of losing Henry in this maze of conspiracy and violence, of watching his illness progress while they ran from shadows and chased century-old secrets. She was afraid that their final years together would be consumed by other people's crimes, that they'd die before seeing justice for Eleanor or the 1,500 Titanic victims whose names filled those hidden manifests. Henry reached for her hand, his wedding ring loose on his finger, another reminder of how much their world had already changed. "We're past the point where fear matters," he said quietly. "Whatever happens to us, those documents exist now. The truth is out in the world, ready to be discovered." Dr. Holbrook's expression softened with recognition of what they were sacrificing. "You could still walk away. Take what evidence you have to the authorities, hope official channels will pursue justice. It would be safer than what I'm asking you to do." Margaret almost laughed at the suggestion. Official channels that might be compromised by the same institutional power that had orchestrated maritime murder and monitored families for generations? They'd already moved beyond the realm where official protection meant anything. The conspiracy that could sink the Titanic and cover it up for 111 years wouldn't be troubled by elderly whistleblowers filing police reports. "Eleanor kept their secrets for 70 years, Margaret said, standing with newfound resolution. "She protected her family through silence and compliance, but I won't protect mine the same way. If Henry and I die pursuing this, at least we'll die fighting for something that matters more than our own comfort." As they prepared to separate and begin their desperate evidence gathering, Margaret felt the full magnitude of crossing from victims to active resistance. They were no longer just inheritors of dangerous secrets. They were investigators pursuing justice that powerful forces had spent over a century preventing. Every archive they visited, every family they contacted, every document they uncovered would either bring them closer to exposing the truth or closer to elimination. The ordeal that would determine not just their survival, but the fate of 111 years of hidden justice was finally beginning. The dark moment. Margaret stood in the rain outside Lady Pemberton's Belgravia townhouse, staring at the black wreath hanging on the door. The elderly woman who might have held crucial evidence about the White Star Line correspondence had died 3 days ago, the same day they'd discovered the sealed room. The timing felt like a mockery of their desperate hope. Her burner phone buzzed with a text from Henry. "Ashford family papers destroyed in house fire yesterday. No survivors to interview. Another dead end, another coincidence that stretched credibility beyond breaking point." Margaret's hands shook as she realized the pattern. Every lead Dr. Holbrook had given them was systematically disappearing. The rain soaked through her coat as she walked toward the underground station, each step feeling heavier than the last. 2 hours of careful investigation had yielded nothing but fresh graves and burned archives. Whoever was orchestrating this cleanup had resources that dwarfed anything she'd imagined. The ability to eliminate witnesses and evidence across multiple locations simultaneously, making it all look like natural misfortune. Her phone rang as she descended into the tube station. Dr. Holbrook's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "They took the documents," she said without preamble. "All of them. Someone accessed my office with proper credentials. University security footage shows nothing unusual, but everything we found in that sealed room is gone. Even my photographs of the pages, deleted from every backup." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. The bearer bonds, the passenger manifests, the confession letter that had connected Eleanor to the Titanic conspiracy, all of it vanished as if their discovery had never happened. 70 years of Eleanor's careful preservation, undone in a single morning of professional efficiency. "How is that possible?" Margaret whispered, though she already understood. They weren't fighting amateur criminals but institutional power, with unlimited resources and century-old protocols for containing exactly this kind of exposure. "There's more," Dr. Holbrook continued, her academic composure cracking. "I've been suspended pending investigation into missing historical documents. They're claiming I stole maritime artifacts for private sale. My credentials are revoked, my access terminated. 20 years of research, my grandfather's work. It's all being characterized as academic fraud." Margaret sank onto a bench in the station, passengers flowing around her like water around a stone. The methodical destruction of their evidence was only the beginning. Dr. Holbrook's professional reputation was being systematically demolished, her credibility eliminated so thoroughly that anything she might say publicly would be dismissed as the desperate lies of a disgraced historian. The train arrived with a mechanical screech that seemed to echo Margaret's internal collapse. She climbed aboard mechanically, her reflection in the window showing a woman who looked decades older than she had 3 days ago. The discovery that was supposed to expose a century of hidden crimes had instead triggered their enemy's most sophisticated response, not violence, but the surgical removal of every piece of evidence and every credible witness. Her phone buzzed again. Henry, checking in as scheduled. But when she answered, the voice that spoke wasn't her husband's. "Mrs. Thornfield." The tone was professionally pleasant, the kind used by insurance adjusters and funeral directors. "Your husband is safe. For now. But he's experiencing complications from his chemotherapy that require immediate medical attention." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "Where is he?" "A private medical facility where he can receive appropriate care. The same facility where he'll remain until you and Dr. Holbrook demonstrate appropriate discretion regarding certain historical matters that are better left undisturbed." The casual mention of Dr. Holbrook confirmed what Margaret had already begun to suspect. They'd been monitored from the moment they left the manor house, their every move anticipated and countered by enemies who'd had over a century to perfect these techniques. "What do you want?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "Silence," the voice replied. "The same silence your grandmother Eleanor maintained so successfully." She understood that some truths are too dangerous for public consumption, that certain secrets serve a greater good by remaining hidden. "We hope you'll demonstrate the same wisdom." The line went dead, leaving Margaret alone with the train's rhythmic clacking and the weight of complete defeat. Every avenue they'd pursued had been sealed against them, every ally compromised, every piece of evidence erased. Henry was being held hostage for her compliance, his cancer treatment weaponized against any resistance she might consider. Margaret stared at her reflection in the dark window and saw Eleanor's face looking back. The same expression of resigned defeat, the same acceptance of powerlessness against forces too vast to comprehend. 3 days of hope and determination had been systematically dismantled, leaving her exactly where her grandmother had been 70 years ago, alone, silent, and carrying unbearable knowledge she could never share. The truth about the Titanic, about the 1,500 victims whose deaths had concealed a handful of murders, would remain buried. Justice for Eleanor and Thomas Ashford, for Dr. Holbrook's grandfather and countless others who died protecting or pursuing these secrets, would be postponed indefinitely. All seemed lost. Margaret closed her eyes against the train window's cold glass, feeling the weight of Eleanor's silence settling over her like a burial shroud. But as the darkness pressed in, something shifted in her understanding. Not surrender, but a sudden, crystalline realization that made her sit upright with electric clarity. She wasn't Eleanor. The thought struck her with revolutionary force. For 3 days, she'd been unconsciously following the same path her grandmother had walked 70 years ago, the gradual retreat into protective silence, the acceptance that some enemies were too powerful to fight. But Eleanor had been 23 years old in 1912, alone and terrified, with no allies and no understanding of the full conspiracy she'd witnessed. Margaret was 68, with 4 decades of research experience and a lifetime of connections these people couldn't possibly monitor. More crucially, she finally understood what her grandmother had really done. Eleanor hadn't just kept silent, she'd prepared. Margaret's mind raced as pieces clicked into place. Eleanor's meticulous record-keeping, her insistence on preserving every document and photograph from their family history, the way she'd maintained relationships with other maritime families, always asking careful questions about their ancestors' experiences, the coded references in her journals that Margaret had dismissed as an elderly woman's confused memories. Eleanor had spent 70 years building a network. Margaret fumbled for her phone, not the burner device but her original mobile, and scrolled through contacts she'd accumulated during decades of historical research. Names that had seemed irrelevant 3 days ago now blazed with possibility: maritime museum curators in Halifax, genealogical societies in New York, descendants of Titanic passengers scattered across 3 continents, people who'd been researching the same gaps in official records, the same suspicious inconsistencies, the same convenient deaths that had claimed Dr. Holbrook's grandfather. They weren't alone. They'd never been alone. The conspiracy that had spent 111 years eliminating threats had created something they'd never anticipated: a distributed resistance of researchers, historians, and descendant families who'd been quietly documenting irregularities for decades. People who didn't know they were part of Eleanor's network, who'd been guided by her careful questions and subtle encouragement to preserve exactly the evidence that could now expose the truth. Margaret's hands steadied as she began typing messages, not to organize a desperate evidence-gathering mission, but to activate a network that had been decades in the making. Every maritime historian Eleanor had befriended, every genealogical society she'd supported, every family she'd connected with during her careful decades of preparation. The confession letter was gone, but Margaret remembered every word. The passenger manifests had vanished, but she'd memorized the names that mattered. The bearer bonds were beyond reach, but their serial numbers were burned into her memory. Most importantly, she finally understood the real message Eleanor had left in that sealed room. Not evidence to be preserved in secret, but tools for a revelation that required proper timing. Eleanor had waited 70 years for someone with the right combination of research skills, moral courage, and desperate necessity to find that room. She'd needed someone who would be threatened enough to fight back, but experienced enough to recognize the true scope of what they'd discovered. Someone who would understand that exposing a conspiracy this vast required more than documents. It required the coordinated action of everyone who'd been touched by its crimes. Margaret's phone began buzzing with responses. Maritime historians from around the world who'd been waiting years for someone to connect the fragments they'd been preserving. Descendant families who'd harbored suspicions about their ancestors' mysterious deaths. Researchers who'd been quietly documenting the same pattern of convenient accidents and missing records. Each response revealed another piece of Eleanor's invisible architecture. References to documents safely stored in private collections, testimonies recorded by elderly survivors before their deaths, insurance records that had never been properly explained. A constellation of evidence that could only be seen when viewed from the proper perspective, arranged by a woman who'd understood that some truths could only be revealed when their enemies had become overconfident. The people who'd erased Dr. Holbrook's evidence and eliminated Lady Pemberton had made a crucial error. They'd focused on obvious threats while ignoring the patient work Eleanor had been doing for 70 years. They'd silenced the academic who might have exposed them immediately, but they'd awakened a network that had been specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of assault. Margaret felt Eleanor's presence as she crafted her final message, not to her scattered allies but to the enemies who were certainly monitoring her communications. A simple statement that would let them know their century of control was ending. Eleanor Whitmore kept your secrets until someone worthy of the truth could use them properly. That time has come. As responses flooded in from around the world, Margaret realized the revelation wasn't just about the Titanic or century-old crimes. It was about understanding that resistance could take forms that spanned generations. That justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. Eleanor had been playing a longer game than anyone imagined, and Margaret was finally ready to help her win it. The train carried her toward London, but she was no longer traveling toward defeat. She was heading toward the culmination of Eleanor's 70-year plan to expose the truth that had shaped both their lives. The train pulled into London Paddington as Margaret's phone continued buzzing with responses from around the world. Each message revealed another strand of Eleanor's carefully woven web. Maritime historians who'd been quietly documenting inconsistencies, genealogical societies that had preserved testimonies dismissed by official channels, private collectors who'd safeguarded documents that had mysteriously vanished from public archives. Dr. Sarah Chen from the Halifax Maritime Museum, your grandmother guided my research toward passenger manifests that never matched official records. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to ask the right questions. The Ashford Family Historical Society in Boston, Eleanor convinced my great-aunt to record her memories about discrepancies in survivor testimonies. The recordings are in our private vault. A maritime insurance researcher in Liverpool, your grandmother suggested I examine claim patterns from 1912. The financial irregularities are extensive and well documented. Margaret stepped off the train with growing amazement at the scope of Eleanor's preparation. Her grandmother hadn't just kept silent for 70 years, she'd been recruiting. Every casual conversation at historical societies, every genealogical conference she'd attended, every maritime anniversary she commemorated had been opportunities to identify allies and guide their research toward crucial gaps in the official narrative. The enemies who'd held Henry hostage had eliminated obvious evidence while remaining blind to the distributed network Eleanor had been building. They'd focused on dramatic threats, sealed rooms, academic researchers, concentrated document caches, while ignoring the patient work of connecting scattered fragments across multiple continents and generations. Margaret found a quiet corner of the station and began coordinating what she now understood was Eleanor's master plan. The network wasn't just a collection of researchers, it was a precisely designed revelation machine that could withstand exactly the kind of systematic suppression they were facing. Dr. James Morrison in New York had passenger interviews his grandfather had conducted but never published. The Widener family descendants possessed insurance correspondence that raised troubling questions about advanced knowledge of the disaster. A private collector in Southampton had acquired White Star Line documents from estate sales, documents that contained references to passengers who'd been traveling under assumed identities. Each connection revealed Eleanor's strategic thinking. She'd guided researchers toward evidence that seemed innocuous in isolation but became damning when assembled. Financial records that showed unusual trading patterns in the weeks before the disaster. Passenger testimonies that mentioned crew members giving contradictory safety instructions to different classes of travelers. Insurance claims that had been processed with suspicious speed for certain deceased passengers. Margaret's admiration for her grandmother's patience grew with every revelation. Eleanor could have exposed fragments of the conspiracy at any point during the past 70 years, but she'd understood that partial revelations could be contained and discredited. Instead, she'd waited for the right moment, when her enemies had become overconfident enough to reveal the full scope of their capabilities. And when technology existed to coordinate a simultaneous global revelation, her phone rang. Henry's voice, weak but unmistakably his own. "Margaret, they're letting me call to negotiate." His words carried carefully controlled anger. "They want you to stand down the investigation, promise silence, return to Southampton, and resume normal life. Are you hurt?" she asked, walking toward the taxi queue, while simultaneously texting coordinates to her growing network of allies. "Physically, no. They're actually providing excellent cancer care." His bitter laugh carried decades of marriage communication. "They want me healthy enough that my continued well-being provides proper leverage for your compliance." Margaret felt cold fury crystallize into tactical clarity. Tell them Eleanor Whitmore spent 70 years preparing for exactly this moment. Their leverage assumes I'm operating alone. "Margaret, what are you—" Tell them to check the maritime history departments at universities worldwide. Check genealogical societies, private collectors, insurance archives. Tell them Eleanor didn't just preserve evidence, she distributed it beyond their ability to contain. The silence stretched before Henry spoke again, his voice carrying newfound hope. "You found Eleanor's real plan. She never intended for us to fight them directly. She knew they were too powerful, too established. But she also knew their strength was concentrated. They could eliminate obvious threats but couldn't monitor every descendant family, every historical society, every maritime researcher who'd been quietly preserving fragments of truth." Margaret climbed into a taxi, giving the driver an address Dr. Chen had provided, a private meeting location where physical evidence could be examined safely. Around the world, Eleanor's network was moving towards similar meeting points, each group bringing pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across continents and generations. "The revelation isn't coming from a sealed room or academic institution they can compromise," Margaret continued, watching London flow past the window. "It's coming from everywhere at once, from people they never knew existed, carrying evidence they never knew survived." As the taxi navigated toward her destination, Margaret felt the weight of isolation lifting. They weren't desperate fugitives racing against elimination. They were the activation point for a resistance that had been 70 years in the making, designed by a woman who'd understood that some battles could only be won through patience and preparation. Eleanor's time had finally come. The meeting location Dr. Chen had provided turned out to be a private library in Bloomsbury, its Georgian facade concealing rooms lined with maritime archives that had been collected across generations. Margaret entered to find she wasn't the first arrival. 3 other people were already examining documents spread across mahogany tables, their faces bearing the intense concentration of researchers who'd finally found missing pieces to puzzles they'd been working decades to solve. Dr. Chen looked up from a collection of passenger testimonies, her expression mixing vindication with sobering gravity. "Mrs. Thornfield, what your grandmother set in motion, it's extraordinary and terrifying." Margaret approached the table where documents from around the world were being assembled, not the originals from the sealed room, which had been beyond recovery, but the distributed copies and complementary evidence Eleanor had guided others to preserve. Insurance records from 3 countries, passenger interviews conducted in the months after the disaster, but never published, financial documents showing trading patterns that suggested advanced knowledge of catastrophe. "How many people are involved?" Margaret asked, watching as more researchers arrived with additional materials. 47 confirmed contributors across 6 continents, replied Dr. Morrison, who'd arrived from New York with passenger interviews his grandfather had conducted. Eleanor somehow identified and connected every major maritime research family that had been documenting irregularities. "We've been unknowingly collaborating for decades." Margaret felt the magnitude of her grandmother's preparations settle over her. Eleanor had turned her forced silence into strategic advantage, using 70 years to build something their enemies couldn't simply eliminate, through their usual methods of academic discreditation and evidence removal. The conspiracy that had controlled the narrative for over a century was facing something they'd never encountered, a revelation designed to survive suppression. Her phone buzzed with updates from coordinators worldwide. Similar meetings were occurring in Halifax, Boston, Southampton, and Liverpool. Each location was assembling evidence that corroborated the others, creating redundancy that made selective elimination impossible. The truth about the Titanic wasn't emerging from a single source that could be discredited, but from a coordinated presentation by established researchers with impeccable credentials and decades of careful documentation. "The financial evidence alone is overwhelming," said Dr. Patricia Williams from the Southampton Maritime Archive. "Insurance policies purchased in the weeks before the voyage, targeting specific passengers. Trading positions that would benefit from certain deaths. Bank transfers that occurred between the disaster and official confirmation of casualties." Dr. Chen spread out passenger manifests that had been preserved in private collections. "The names your grandmother mentioned, the ones that appeared in the sealed room but not in official records, we've found them referenced in crew testimonies, in insurance claims, in financial documents. They were real passengers whose existence was systematically erased." Margaret studied the accumulated evidence with growing amazement at Eleanor's strategic vision. Her grandmother hadn't just preserved proof of the conspiracy, she'd guided researchers to build an unshakable foundation that could withstand any attempt at dismissal. Academic institutions could be compromised, official archives could be altered, but a distributed network of private collectors and family historians created evidence that was impossible to suppress completely. "When do we go public?" asked Dr. Morrison, his voice carrying the weight of finally being able to honor his grandfather's suppressed research. Margaret considered the question, feeling the responsibility Eleanor had passed to her across 7 decades. Going public too early would give their enemies time to mount counterattacks, character assassination, evidence challenges, the machinery of official denial they'd perfected over generations. But waiting too long risked Henry's safety and gave the conspiracy time to adapt to this new threat. "We need to coordinate the timing precisely," she said, her librarian-esque training in project management finally finding proper application. "Simultaneous presentations across multiple platforms, too many targets for them to suppress effectively." Her phone rang, Henry again, but this time his voice carried urgent warning rather than negotiation. "Margaret, they know what you're doing. They're not trying to negotiate anymore. They're mobilizing. Legal challenges, injunctions against publications, pressure on academic institutions. They're treating this as an existential threat." "Because it is," Margaret replied, watching the researchers around her work with focused intensity. "Eleanor spent 70 years building something they can't control. They're also escalating their threats. Not just against us, but against anyone involved in what they're calling a coordinated campaign of historical fraud." Margaret felt the weight of responsibility for everyone Eleanor's network had drawn into this final confrontation. The conspiracy had survived by making resistance too costly for individuals to sustain, but Eleanor had created collective action that distributed both risk and resolve across dozens of committed researchers. "Tell them it's too late," Margaret said, watching Dr. Chen photograph documents for immediate distribution to secure servers worldwide. "Eleanor's network is already implementing the revelation. Their century of control is ending whether they escalate or not." As she ended the call, Margaret realized they'd reached the point Eleanor had been building toward for 70 years. The evidence was assembled, the network was activated, and their enemies were moving from containment to desperate counterattack. The final confrontation Eleanor had prepared her for was beginning. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the phone. Realizing their enemy's shift from containment to open warfare meant every moment of delay increased the danger for Henry and everyone in Eleanor's network. Around the Bloomsbury Library, researchers worked with mounting urgency, but she could see uncertainty creeping into their movements as the magnitude of what they faced became clear. "We accelerate everything," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally understood their true position. Eleanor didn't spend 70 years building this network for gradual revelation. She designed it for exactly this moment, when they're panicked enough to show their full capabilities. Dr. Chen looked up from her documentation work. "Margaret, if we release incomplete evidence, they'll tear it apart. Academic reputation assumes we're playing by normal rules," Margaret interrupted, feeling Eleanor's strategic thinking crystallize in her mind. But Eleanor knew they never played by normal rules. They've spent over a century rewriting history through elimination and intimidation. We don't defeat that with careful peer review. She began pacing between the tables, her librarian's mind organizing the chaos of evidence into a coherent attack pattern. Eleanor hadn't just preserved the truth. She'd created a revelation designed to overwhelm her enemy's ability to respond. Multiple simultaneous releases across different platforms, backed by researchers whose credentials couldn't be easily dismissed, supported by physical evidence that had been distributed beyond any single point of failure. "Dr. Morrison, how quickly can your grandfather's interviews be prepared for broadcast?" she asked, her voice gaining momentum as Eleanor's master plan became clear. "Not published, broadcast. Live, simultaneous, across multiple networks. The recordings are digitized and verified," he replied, understanding her urgency. "But securing media coverage for claims this massive—" "Eleanor's network includes journalists," Margaret said, scrolling through her phone for contacts she was only now beginning to fully comprehend. "Investigative reporters who've been following financial irregularities in historical disasters. Documentary filmmakers who've been waiting for evidence to support their suspicions." She didn't just recruit historians. She recruited everyone who would be needed for a complete revelation. Margaret felt the breathtaking scope of her grandmother's preparation wash over her. Eleanor had identified not just the evidence that would expose the conspiracy, but every profession and platform that would be needed to ensure the revelation couldn't be suppressed. Academic researchers to establish credibility, financial experts to explain the insurance fraud, journalists to reach public consciousness, legal scholars to frame the implications. Her phone began ringing with calls from coordinators worldwide, each reporting similar realizations. Eleanor's network wasn't just preserved evidence, it was a complete media operation that had been decades in the making, activated now because their enemy's desperation had created the perfect moment for coordinated revelation. "The documentary filmmaker in Halifax has been ready for 3 years," reported Dr. Williams, reading from her own cascade of messages. Eleanor guided her toward surviving crew testimonies that were recorded but never released. She has professional quality interviews with descendants who've been harboring family secrets. Margaret felt time compressing around them as she understood the choice Eleanor had prepared her to make. They could continue trying to build an unassailable academic case while their enemies systematically eliminated evidence and threatened allies, or they could trust 70 years of preparation and launch Eleanor's complete revelation before opposition could organize effectively. "The insurance fraud evidence goes live in 30 minutes across financial networks," she announced, making the decision that would either vindicate Eleanor's strategy or destroy everyone who trusted her grandmother's vision. "The passenger testimony documentary releases simultaneously on streaming platforms. The academic papers published through multiple journals at the same moment. Eleanor's network implements everything at once." Around the library, researchers looked up from their work with expressions mixing terror and exhilaration. They were abandoning careful verification for coordinated truth-telling, trusting that Eleanor's 70 years of preparation had accounted for the dangers they couldn't see. Margaret's phone buzzed with a message that sent ice through her veins. A photo of Henry in what appeared to be a hospital room, surrounded by equipment that could either be providing cancer treatment or ensuring his dependence on his captor's continued care. The accompanying text was brief: 30 minutes to consider the consequences of your choices. But Eleanor had prepared her for this moment too. Margaret realized the message wasn't just a threat, it was confirmation that their enemies were reacting rather than controlling, responding to Eleanor's timeline instead of implementing their own. After over a century of determining when and how truth emerged, they were finally being forced into desperate defense. Margaret typed her response. Eleanor Whitmore spent 70 years preparing for this moment. Your century of control ends now. Around her, Eleanor's network began implementing the revelation that would either expose a conspiracy that had shaped over a century of history or destroy everyone who'd believed that some truths were worth the ultimate risk to reveal. The 30 minutes passed in a cascade of coordinated revelations that Eleanor's network unleashed with the precision of a military operation. Margaret stood in the Bloomsbury Library, watching monitors as documentary footage aired simultaneously across 3 continents. Financial networks broadcast evidence of insurance fraud spanning generations, and academic journals published papers that had been peer-reviewed in secret for months. Her phone rang. Not Henry this time, but a voice she'd never heard. Cold, cultured, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute control. Mrs. Thornfield, you've made a catastrophic miscalculation. Margaret felt her grandmother's presence strengthening her resolve. Have I? Because from where I'm standing, your century of control just ended on live television. Your husband's cancer treatment can be adjusted. The other researchers in your grandmother's network have families, careers, lives that can be systematically destroyed. You've traded temporary publicity for permanent consequences. Around the library, Dr. Chen and the others looked up from their monitoring screens with expressions mixing triumph and growing fear. The revelation was working. Social media exploded with reactions. News networks scrambled to verify the extraordinary claims. Financial markets began reacting to implications of systematic insurance fraud. But Margaret realized their victory had painted targets on everyone involved. Eleanor prepared for your retaliation too, Margaret said, surprising herself with her calm confidence. She knew you'd escalate when cornered. Your grandmother was a romantic fool who underestimated practical power. We've survived exposure attempts before. Academic theories can be discredited, researchers can be marginalized, public attention moves to other scandals. In 6 months, this will be forgotten conspiracy theory. But Margaret had spent enough time in Eleanor's archives to understand the deeper strategy. Her grandmother hadn't just preserved evidence of the Titanic conspiracy, she'd documented the pattern of suppression that followed every attempt to expose it. Eleanor had studied her enemies for 70 years, learning their methods, identifying their weaknesses. Check the financial markets, Margaret said, watching her own screens as Eleanor's coordinated revelation triggered exactly the response her grandmother had anticipated. Your insurance fraud evidence just went public during active trading hours. The companies involved in the original conspiracy, their modern corporate descendants, are facing immediate stockholder lawsuits. The silence stretched longer this time before the voice returned, carrying notes of uncertainty Margaret hadn't heard before. Legal challenges can be managed. Can they? Because Eleanor's network included forensic accountants who've been tracing money flows for decades. They didn't just preserve historical evidence, they followed the financial threads into current operations. Your conspiracy didn't end with the Titanic. It evolved, adapted, continued operating. And now that pattern is being exposed in real time. Margaret felt the breathtaking scope of Eleanor's true plan crystallizing as she spoke. Her grandmother hadn't just sought justice for a historical atrocity, she'd traced a conspiracy that had continued operating across generations, using similar methods to profit from other carefully orchestrated disasters. The Titanic had been their proving ground for techniques they'd refined and repeated for over a century. The ferry disaster that killed my parents, Margaret continued, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Eleanor found evidence of insurance irregularities there too, didn't she? Your people have been orchestrating profitable tragedies for generations, and my grandmother spent 70 years documenting the pattern. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Henry. She answered on speaker, needing everyone to hear. Margaret, they're moving me, said something about containing exposure, limiting damage. His voice carried exhaustion but also stubborn defiance. But before they took my phone, I heard them talking. They're not just worried about the historical evidence, they're panicked about something current. Something about active operations being compromised. Margaret felt ice settle in her stomach as Eleanor's final revelation became clear. The conspiracy hadn't just shaped the past, it was actively shaping the present. And Eleanor's network had just exposed ongoing operations that depended on secrecy to succeed. "Where are they taking you?" Margaret asked. But the line had gone dead. The cultured voice returned to her phone, no longer carrying confident authority but desperate threat. "You have 1 hour to issue public retractions. Claim the evidence was fabricated, the research was flawed. Return to Southampton and resume your quiet retirement." "Or what?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. "Or everyone who trusted your grandmother's romantic vision of justice learns that some truths are more dangerous than the lies they replace." Margaret looked around the library at researchers who dedicated their lives to historical truth, now facing consequences Eleanor might not have fully anticipated. Her grandmother had prepared her for this moment, but the weight of responsibility for everyone in the network felt crushing. Then Dr. Chen spoke from across the room, her voice carrying quiet determination. "Margaret, check the international news feeds." On the monitors, breaking news reports showed Eleanor's revelations spreading beyond their control or their enemies' ability to contain. Government officials calling for investigations, international maritime organizations demanding accountability, families of historical disaster victims finding new hope for answers. Eleanor's 70 years of preparation had created something unprecedented, a truth too large and too coordinated to suppress. Margaret faced her deepest fear directly and chose to trust her grandmother's faith in the power of collective revelation over individual safety. "The hour you offered?" she said into the phone. "We decline." The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her phone in the sudden silence of the Bloomsbury Library. Around her, Eleanor's network continued monitoring their coordinated revelation as it spread across global media, but she felt the weight of what they'd just unleashed settling over her like a shroud. Dr. Chen approached cautiously. "Margaret, we need to discuss what declining their ultimatum means for—" Her phone exploded with calls. Henry's number, then unknown international numbers, then contacts from Eleanor's network worldwide. Margaret answered Henry's call first, her hands shaking as she recognized background voices she'd heard before. "Margaret." Henry's voice carried a strange calm that terrified her more than panic would have. "They want me to deliver a message." "Henry, are you—" "I'm fine. Surprisingly well, actually. The treatment they've been providing is comprehensive." His pause carried weight she didn't want to understand. "But Margaret, I need you to listen carefully. They're offering a trade." Margaret felt her grandmother's courage faltering as the true cost of Eleanor's 70-year plan became clear. "What kind of trade?" "Complete retraction of all evidence in exchange for my continued treatment and everyone's safety." "But Margaret," Henry's voice dropped to barely audible, "the treatment they're providing isn't just keeping me alive, it's keeping me dependent. Without their specific protocols, their particular medications, I have maybe weeks." The revelation hit Margaret like physical blow. Their enemies hadn't just been providing Henry cancer treatment, they'd been ensuring his survival depended entirely on their continued cooperation. Eleanor's network had achieved unprecedented success in exposing the conspiracy, but their enemies had spent the same decades perfecting leverage that made resistance ultimately impossible. "How long have you known?" Margaret asked, understanding now why Henry had seemed so resigned during recent conversations. "Suspected for weeks. Confirmed today when they explained exactly what withdrawal from their treatment program would involve." Henry's voice carried the calm of someone who'd already made an impossible choice. "Margaret, Eleanor prepared you for this moment." She knew they'd make the cost of truth unbearable. Around the library, Dr. Chen and the other researchers had stopped monitoring their successful revelation to listen as Margaret's world collapsed in real time. Eleanor's master plan was working perfectly, too perfectly. Their enemies were cornered, desperate, and retaliating with surgical precision against what each network member valued most. Margaret's phone buzzed with messages from researchers worldwide reporting similar ultimatums. Dr. Morrison's grandson threatened with academic expulsion and fabricated criminal charges. Dr. Williams' daughter's medical license under review for imaginary ethical violations. The Halifax documentary filmmaker facing copyright lawsuits that would bankrupt her family for generations. Eleanor had built a network strong enough to expose the conspiracy, but their enemies had spent the same decades identifying exactly how to make that strength irrelevant. "Margaret," Henry continued, his voice carrying love and something that sounded like relief, "Eleanor left you one final instruction. Check the sealed room again. Behind the portrait of the Titanic passengers, there's something she saved for this exact moment. Henry, I'm not going back to Southampton while they have you." "Yes, you are." Because Eleanor knew this conversation would happen. She knew they'd make the choice impossible, and she prepared an answer. "Trust her one final time." The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone as the scope of Eleanor's true sacrifice became clear. Her grandmother hadn't just risked her own life to preserve evidence. She'd built a plan that would require Margaret to risk everything she loved to complete the revelation. Dr. Chen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Margaret, the revelation is working. Government investigations, launching, financial markets reacting, international pressure building. We could negotiate from a position of strength." "No." Margaret felt Eleanor's final lesson settling into place with crystalline clarity. They're not offering negotiation. They're demonstrating that individual lives will always be expendable when weighed against institutional power. Eleanor knew that. She prepared for it. Margaret looked around the library at researchers who'd trusted her grandmother's vision, now facing consequences that made their success feel like elaborate trap. But Eleanor had anticipated this moment too, the point where victory required choosing truth over safety, collective justice over individual survival. "I'm going back to Southampton," Margaret announced, her voice carrying authority she didn't feel but trusted Eleanor had prepared her to demonstrate. Whatever Eleanor left in that sealed room, it's the final piece of her plan. The piece she saved for when they made the choice between truth and survival. Her phone rang again. The cultured voice returned, carrying satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Thornfield, have you reconsidered our generous offer?" Margaret felt her grandmother's courage flowing through her as she made the choice Eleanor had spent 70 years preparing her to make. "I'm going home," she said. But not to retract anything. To finish what Eleanor started. The silence stretched before the voice returned, carrying uncertainty for the first time. "You're making a tragic mistake." "Maybe," Margaret replied, gathering her things while Eleanor's network watched with expressions mixing admiration and terror. "But it's my mistake to make." She was choosing truth over Henry's life, and Eleanor had somehow known she would. The drive back to Southampton through the October darkness felt like traversing a landscape transformed by grief. Margaret gripped the steering wheel as rain hammered the windshield, each mile carrying her further from the choice that might save Henry and closer to whatever Eleanor had prepared for this moment of ultimate sacrifice. The mansion loomed against storm clouds when she arrived, its Gothic silhouette no longer mysterious but familiar, a repository of secrets that had shaped her entire understanding of courage and consequence. Margaret unlocked the front door with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of carrying Eleanor's 70-year plan to its conclusion. In the library, the sealed room stood open as they'd left it days earlier, but Margaret approached the portrait of Titanic passengers with new understanding. These weren't just victims of a historical disaster. They were Eleanor's constant reminders of what happened when truth remained buried while the guilty escaped consequence. Behind the frame, Her fingers found a hidden compartment she'd missed in earlier searches. Inside lay a single envelope marked with her name in Eleanor's precise handwriting, along with what appeared to be legal documents bearing official seals from multiple governments. Margaret opened the letter with reverent care. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then our enemies have made the choice I anticipated, demonstrating that they will always sacrifice individual lives to protect institutional power. You've discovered what Henry and I both knew. His treatment was designed to create dependency, ensuring your compliance. When revelation threatened their control, I prepared for this moment because I understood that exposing a century-old conspiracy requires accepting costs that seem unbearable. The documents in this compartment represent my final strategy, evidence I've held in reserve not because it was incomplete, but because it was too powerful to release until our enemies had committed themselves beyond retreat. Margaret's hands shook as she examined the documents. International arrest warrants prepared in secret, sealed indictments waiting for judicial approval, extradition agreements between governments who'd been coordinating their response to Eleanor's revelation for months. Her grandmother hadn't just built a network to expose the conspiracy, she'd worked with international authorities to ensure legal consequences would follow exposure. The second page revealed the scope of Eleanor's true preparation. The insurance companies, shipping corporations, and financial institutions that evolved from the original Titanic conspiracy have been under investigation for 3 years. Government forensic accountants have verified our evidence and traced the conspiracy's continuation into current operations. The revelation your network achieved yesterday wasn't just historical exposure, it was the public component of coordinated international law enforcement action. Our enemy's desperation to secure retractions through threatening loved ones has provided prosecutors with evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. Every threat made, every attempt to suppress evidence, every coercive action against network members has been documented and will be used in legal proceedings. Margaret felt her understanding of the previous day's events shifting as Eleanor's final strategy revealed itself. The coordinated revelation hadn't just exposed historical crimes, it had been carefully timed to trigger legal responses that made their enemies' traditional suppression methods into additional evidence of ongoing conspiracy. Her phone buzzed with a call from Dr. Chen. Margaret, are you seeing the international news? Dr. Chen's voice carried excitement and disbelief. Simultaneous raids in London, New York, Hamburg, Belfast. They're arresting executives from companies involved in the original conspiracy. The governments have been coordinating this response for years. Margaret continued reading Eleanor's letter as understanding crystallized. The choice I've prepared you to make isn't between Henry's life and historical truth. It's between accepting that some battles can't be won through individual sacrifice and trusting that collective action, properly coordinated, can achieve justice that seemed impossible. By the time you read this, Henry will be receiving legitimate medical care. Government protection services have been monitoring all network members, prepared to intervene when our enemies revealed themselves through threats and coercion. His apparent dependency on their treatment was itself part of the evidence-gathering operation. Margaret's phone rang. Henry's number. Margaret, where are you? His voice carried strength she hadn't heard in weeks. Southampton. Eleanor's final instructions. Margaret felt tears she'd been suppressing finally falling. Henry, are you safe, free, receiving actual treatment instead of controlled dependency? His voice carried wonder and exhaustion. Margaret, the authorities have been watching this unfold for months. Eleanor didn't just prepare evidence. She coordinated with international law enforcement. They've been protecting us while we gathered the final proof they needed. Margaret sank into Eleanor's chair, feeling the weight of 70 years of preparation settling into resolution around her. Her grandmother had anticipated even this moment, the point where apparent victory felt like devastating loss, where choosing truth seemed to require abandoning love. Eleanor knew, Margaret whispered, understanding finally completing itself. She knew they'd make it feel impossible to choose justice over survival, and she prepared for that too. Outside, the storm was breaking. dawn light filtering through clouds as a century-old conspiracy finally faced the justice Eleanor had spent her entire adult life ensuring would come. 3 months later, Margaret sat in the morning light of their Southampton garden, watching Henry tend to roses that had begun blooming unexpectedly late into the season. The autumn sun caught the silver in his hair as he worked with steady hands, his movements carrying none of the fragility that had marked the weeks when his treatment was controlled by their enemies. "The insurance settlement came through," she called to him, holding up the official documents. "The survivors' families will finally receive compensation that should have been paid over a century ago." Henry looked up from the roses, soil-stained gloves pausing in their work. Eleanor would have appreciated the irony. The companies that profited from suppressing the truth are now funding its resolution. Margaret nodded, though she understood the settlement represented only the financial dimension of their transformation. The woman who had inherited this estate 3 months ago, anxious about retirement finances, overwhelmed by the mansion's decay, uncertain about their future, felt like someone she'd known in another lifetime. The phone rang inside the house, and Margaret recognized Dr. Chen's number. These calls had become weekly traditions, updates from Eleanor's network as the international investigations progressed. "Margaret, wonderful news from the Hamburg prosecutions," Dr. Chen reported. "The court accepted our evidence regarding the ferry disasters. Pattern of insurance fraud spanning 8 decades confirmed. Your parents' death wasn't random tragedy, it was orchestrated profit, and there will finally be accountability." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the grief she'd carried for 40 years shifting into something resembling peace. Eleanor documented everything, didn't she? Even disasters we thought were unrelated. "Your grandmother was extraordinary. The prosecutors say they've never seen evidence preparation so comprehensive or strategic coordination so sophisticated. She spent 70 years building a case that was legally unassailable." After the call ended, Margaret walked through the mansion that had become truly their home rather than an overwhelming inheritance. The sealed room now served as Eleanor's memorial library, its century-old secrets transformed into public record, its bearer bonds converted into educational funding for maritime safety research. But the deepest change wasn't in their financial security or the international recognition of Eleanor's achievement. Margaret had discovered reserves of courage she'd never known she possessed, the capacity to risk everything for principles that transcended personal comfort. The retired librarian who had once cataloged other people's stories had found herself at the center of rewriting history. Henry came inside, carrying roses for the kitchen table. "Dr. Morrison called while you were speaking with Dr. Chen. The Belfast Memorial is ready for dedication. They want you to speak at the ceremony honoring the passengers whose names were hidden from the official records." "Including grandmother Eleanor," Margaret murmured, still adjusting to the reality that her family's tragedy had become part of public history. "I never thought I'd be someone who gave speeches about courage and justice." "You always were," Henry replied, arranging the roses with careful attention. "You just needed circumstances that required you to discover it." Margaret smiled, recognizing the truth in his observation. The woman who had meticulously researched historical mysteries had simply applied those same skills to a mystery that demanded action rather than academic distance. Eleanor's training had been preparation, but Margaret's transformation had been choosing to trust that preparation when everything she loved was at stake. The afternoon brought visitors, researchers from the network, government officials coordinating restitution programs, journalists documenting the conspiracy's far-reaching implications. Margaret moved through these interactions with confidence that still surprised her, speaking with authority about evidence interpretation and historical significance. As evening approached, she and Henry sat in the library where their adventure had begun, surrounded by books that now seemed like old friends rather than overwhelming collections. The random inheritance that had once felt like burden had become the foundation for the most meaningful work of their lives. "Do you miss our quiet retirement?" Henry asked, stirring tea in china that had once belonged to Titanic conspirators and now served justice advocates. Margaret considered the question seriously. Their former life felt peaceful in memory, predictable routines, manageable concerns, security that depended only on their own choices. But it also felt incomplete, unaware of the capacity for significance that lay dormant within ordinary circumstances. "I miss feeling safe," she admitted, "but I wouldn't trade what we've learned about ourselves. Eleanor showed us that age doesn't limit courage, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they trust their preparation and accept necessary risks." Outside, Southampton's lights twinkled across the harbor where the Titanic had begun its final voyage. But inside the mansion, Margaret and Henry had found something Eleanor always intended them to discover, that inheriting truth came with the responsibility to act upon it, and that accepting that responsibility transformed inheritance into legacy. Margaret opened Eleanor's research journal, no longer seeking secrets but adding her own documentation of how justice, properly prepared and courageously executed, could indeed triumph over institutional power that seemed insurmountable. The pen moved steadily across the journal pages as Margaret documented their latest correspondence from families worldwide, descendants of passengers whose names had finally been restored to official records, survivors of ferry accidents, now recognized as part of a larger pattern, researchers uncovering similar conspiracies in their own countries. Eleanor's revelation had become a catalyst for historical reckonings across multiple continents. "The McAllister family wrote again," she told Henry, reading from a letter that had arrived that morning. "Their great-grandfather's name will be added to the Titanic Memorial in Liverpool, after a century of being told he never existed." Henry looked up from the maritime safety legislation he'd been reviewing. Their lives had settled into a rhythm Margaret never could have imagined 6 months ago. Correspondence with international advocacy groups, consultation on historical investigations, testimony for legal proceedings that continued to unfold. The quiet retirement they'd once planned felt like a half-life in comparison. Eleanor would have loved seeing these letters, Henry observed, watching Margaret file the correspondence in the organizational system her grandmother had established decades earlier. Recognition for every name she fought to preserve. Margaret smiled, feeling Eleanor's presence most strongly in moments like these, when individual acknowledgement became part of collective justice. The sealed room now hosted monthly gatherings of researchers, survivors' families, and government officials coordinating ongoing investigations. What had begun as a hidden repository of secrets had become a center for transparent collaboration. The afternoon brought their weekly call from Southampton's mayor, updating them on the Maritime Museum expansion funded by the settlement money. Margaret listened with satisfaction as he described exhibits that would tell the complete story, both the original disaster and the century-long cover-up that had followed. "The international visitors keep increasing," the mayor reported. "People come to understand how ordinary citizens can challenge institutional power when they're properly prepared and willing to accept significant risks." After the call ended, Margaret walked through rooms that had completed their transformation from mysterious inheritance to purposeful home. The portraits of unknown ancestors now shared wall space with photographs from the dedication ceremonies, the arrests, the memorial services that had marked their victory's progression from private discovery to public recognition. But the deepest satisfaction came from unexpected moments of normalcy. Henry's health had stabilized under legitimate treatment. Their financial worries had disappeared with the legal settlements, and their relationship had been strengthened by shared purpose that transcended their individual concerns. "The documentary crew is returning next week," Henry mentioned, joining her in the library where afternoon light illuminated Eleanor's research materials, now preserved as historical artifacts. Final interviews for the international release. Margaret nodded, still adjusting to their roles as public figures in a story that had captured worldwide attention. The retired librarian who had once avoided social gatherings now spoke regularly at conferences, universities, and government hearings about the responsibility that came with inheriting truth. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd sold the estate immediately," she mused, touching the desk where Eleanor had worked for 7 decades. "If we'd been too overwhelmed to investigate properly." "Eleanor wouldn't have let that happen," Henry replied with certainty that had grown stronger over the months. "She knew exactly what she was passing on to you, The preparation, the evidence, the network, the character assessment, all of it was intentional. As evening approached, Margaret felt the profound contentment that came from understanding her place in a story larger than her individual existence. Eleanor's conspiracy had spanned generations, but so had the resistance to it. Margaret had inherited not just evidence, but the responsibility to ensure that justice delayed would not become justice denied. She opened the journal to a fresh page, preparing to document the day's developments as Eleanor had taught her. But tonight, she also wanted to record something more personal, the recognition that accepting extraordinary responsibility had revealed extraordinary capacity for significance she'd never known she possessed. Outside, Southampton's harbor reflected stars and city lights, the same waters where the Titanic had begun its journey toward disaster and conspiracy. But inside the mansion, Margaret and Henry had completed a different voyage, from overwhelming inheritance to meaningful legacy, from fear of inadequacy to confidence in their ability to serve justice that transcended their individual concerns. The transformation felt permanent now, woven into their daily routines and future plans. They were no longer retired people managing an unexpected inheritance. They had become custodians of truth, advocates for historical accuracy, and living proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice when they trusted their preparation and accepted the risks that came with choosing principles over comfort. Margaret wrote steadily as darkness settled over the estate, documenting not just facts, but the emotional resonance of having discovered that age and ordinariness were no barriers to significance when courage was properly applied. Eleanor's greatest gift hadn't been the evidence or the money. It had been the demonstration that anyone could become someone worthy of inheriting truth and acting upon it.